They seized a grieving widow's driveway without a word of notice. They didn't just shift a property line, they waited until the week of the funeral to pour the concrete. By the time I returned from burying my husband, my private access had been transformed into a construction zone for a community gate I never voted for. I remember staring at the orange spray paint through the kitchen window, clutching a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. My husband, Arthur, had been gone for exactly 6 weeks. The house felt cavernous, the silence far too heavy, and the driveway, the one he had meticulously power washed every single spring, suddenly bore a jagged, neon stripe running 3 feet deep into our property. I didn't rush out to scream. I didn't even step outside. I simply watched from behind the curtain as 2 men in reflective vests parked a truck at the curb. They weren't city workers. They were contractors hired by the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. Without a knock, without a phone call, and certainly without my permission, they began unloading stacks of heavy wrought iron fencing and bags of concrete. The HOA had been posturing about neighborhood beautification and secure access for months in the newsletters Arthur used to read. Apparently, their grand design for a new decorative community gate involved absorbing a portion of my underutilized side turnout. They didn't see it as a woman's private property. They saw it as the path of least resistance. I felt a hollow sort of exhaustion. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was just trying to remember where Arthur kept the spare light bulbs. But as the first post-hole digger bit into the asphalt he had cared for, the injustice didn't feel loud. It felt cold. It felt as though they were betting on the fact that a widow in mourning wouldn't have the energy to say no. The first certified letter arrived 3 days later. It wasn't an apology. It was a notice of utility easement usage. The tone was clinical, signed by the HOA president, Margaret Thorne. Margaret lived 4 houses down in a sprawling brick colonial. She was the kind of woman who measured her neighbor's grass with a ruler and sent fines for unauthorized seasonal wreaths if they stayed up a day past January 5th. I called the management office twice. Both times I was told the same thing. The board has broad authority to improve common areas and security infrastructure. When I finally caught Margaret walking her dog past my house, I walked to the edge of the driveway. My voice was thin, but steady. "Margaret, your crew is digging into my land," I said. "That's my turnout. Arthur built that for our camper years ago." She didn't stop walking. She just slowed down, giving me a tight, practiced smile. "The new security gate requires a wider swing radius for emergency vehicles, Evelyn. We checked the old community maps. That strip has always been designated for ancillary use. It's for the good of the whole street, safer, with higher property values. You understand." She spoke to me as if I were a confused child. Over the next month, the fence went up. It was a massive, ornate structure of black iron and heavy masonry pillars. One pillar sat squarely where my husband used to park his truck. Then came the fines. Because I had obstructed the workers by parking my own car in what remained of my driveway, the HOA issued 3 separate $200 penalties for interference with community improvements. I looked at the bills on my counter, stacked next to Arthur's death certificates. They weren't just taking the land. They were charging me for the privilege of losing it. They expected me to give up. The silence of the house became my office. I spent weeks sitting at Arthur's old mahogany desk, surrounded by the faint scent of his pipe tobacco and the stacks of manila folders he had meticulously kept for 30 years. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for a reason to stop feeling so small. I started with the HOA bylaws, which were a labyrinth of fine print and presidential discretion clauses. Every time I thought I found a loophole, another paragraph seemed to close it. I visited the county clerk's office twice, sitting in a fluorescent lit basement, scrolling through digital archives of property lines. The HOA maps Margaret had mentioned showed the strip as variable use, a vague term that usually favored the board. I felt defeated. My eyes burned from reading legal jargon, and the heavy thud of the new iron gate closing every night felt like a physical blow to my chest. I was ready to pack the folders away and simply pay the fines. But as I went to close Arthur's house improvements file, a small, yellowed envelope slipped out from behind a 1994 plumbing receipt. It was a hand-drawn survey, dated 3 years before the HOA was even incorporated. Attached to it was a notarized deed of variance Arthur had filed with the city when he built the turnout for our camper. I held my breath. According to this document, that specific 3-foot strip wasn't just my property, it was designated as a permanent private right-of-way for drainage and emergency egress, specifically protected by a municipal ordinance that predated the neighborhood's developer. The HOA hadn't just built on my land, they had built over a city-protected drainage easement that required a 10-foot clearance for utility maintenance. In their rush to beautify the entrance and squeeze me out, Margaret and the board had neglected to check the city's master infrastructure map. They hadn't just ignored a widow, they had ignored the city's flood control requirements. I didn't call Margaret, I didn't send an angry email to the board. Instead, I drove to the City Planning and Development Office with Arthur's yellowed envelope and a set of time-stamped photos of the new black iron pillars. I sat quietly in a plastic chair for 2 hours until a weary inspector named Miller took my file. He looked at the deed, then at the HOA's site plan, and finally at the city's drainage map. He didn't say much, but he did sigh, a long, heavy sound that told me exactly what I needed to know. A week later, a bright white city SUV pulled up to the curb. 2 men got out with clipboards and tape measures. Margaret came out of her house, jogging down the sidewalk with that same practiced, authoritative smile, ready to explain community improvements to the city. Here is what they didn't know. The city hadn't just come to look at my property line, they had come to enforce a Class 1 obstruction code. Because the HOA had poured concrete footings directly over a primary storm drain access point, they had compromised the neighborhood's entire drainage integrity. The ancillary use Margaret had bragged about was actually a high-priority utility easement. I watched from my porch as the inspector's face remained stone cold. He wasn't interested in property values or curb appeal. He handed Margaret a bright orange document, a formal order of abatement. This structure is an illegal encroachment on municipal infrastructure, the inspector said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. You have 48 hours to clear the easement, or the city will dispatch a crew to do it at the HOA's expense. And since it's a drainage violation, there's a daily fine starting now. Margaret looked at the massive, expensive gate, then at me. I didn't smile. I just adjusted my sweater and went back inside to finish my tea. The demolition began on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't loud or celebratory, it was just the heavy, mechanical sound of a jackhammer breaking through the HOA's expensive mistake. The wrought iron gate, which had cost the neighborhood nearly $40,000 in dues, was hauled away in pieces on the back of a flatbed truck. Because the board had failed to pull the proper municipal permits, relying instead on their own broad authority, the city's fines were categorized as negligence. The HOA's insurance carrier refused to cover the loss. Every homeowner on the street received a special assessment notice to cover the $12,000 demolition fee and the restoration of my driveway. Margaret resigned from the board 3 weeks later, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew the truth. Her name was all over the unpermitted work orders. She doesn't look at my house when she walks her dog anymore. She crosses the street before she even gets close to my property line. My driveway is quiet again. The orange paint is gone, replaced by fresh, black asphalt that the HOA had to pay a premium to match. Sometimes I sit on my porch and look at the spot where Arthur used to park. It's empty, but it's mine. The injustice was quiet, and the fix was even quieter. They thought I was too tired to care, too broken to look at the paperwork. They were wrong. How long would you have stayed silent? If you enjoyed this story of standing your ground, make sure to subscribe for more tales of justice and unexpected victories. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of the quiet fight for what's right.